Hello and welcome to Chapter 4. The Old House at Home, Singleton, West Sussex, January 1917. The public room of the inn is full when I reach it. At the public door, a man emerges with a glass clenched in his fist. He looks at me in silence, and in the light from the carriage lamp over the door, I recognise the greengrocer. Good evening, Mr. Evans. He doesn't react at first, then suddenly, "That's never young Leo, is it?" "Yes, sir." But he doesn't listen to me. Lurching back into the inn, he shouts, "John, is this your boy out here?" Suddenly the street is full of my father's customers. They surround me as they might a beast at auction, prodding me with their eyes as they suck on their pipes. "I remember you when you were so high." Smithson, the butcher, looks me up and down. "You're not much taller now." The old joke. He peers at me. "Thought you'd gone for a soldier." "Not exactly." "I'm sorry about your mother, Leo," Evans says softly. "It's a terrible illness. I remember how quickly your brother went." "Quite the returned native, aren't you?" Smithson beams at me. "We all thought you'd gone for good." "No, just lots to do over there." Evans presses my arm. "We're glad to see you back." "I'm glad someone is." I smile ruefully. "I've just been to see the vicar." "No fattened calf for you, then?" Smithson leers at me cheerfully. "I'm not surprised," Evan interjects, "at Smithson's prices." "Hey!" The butcher is outraged. Evans chuckles, a dry, crackling sound that reminds of the paper bags he keeps on a string in his shop. I've never heard him laugh before, and he also seems to be unaccustomed to the sensation, for he bends double, gripping my arm for support, apparently helpless in his mirth. I tell you, Leo, for the price of a calf, this man will wrap up a pound of veal cutlets and a dish of brawn, and still expect a tip at Christmas." "Oh," Smithson blusters in his turn, "well, at least a pound sold in my shop means a pound." As the conversation between these old friends takes a distinctly slanderous turn, and the cold night air begins to bite, I leave them and go inside. Here the prevailing conversations turn on the weather and food shortages. My reappearance excites nothing more than a few raised heads before the old farmers go back to arguing over the likelihood of the Agricultural Committee imposing a cultivation of lands order on the Goodwood estate. "Want a drink, Leo?" My father, standing behind the bar in his shirt-sleeves, a cloth thrown over his shoulder, is watching me carefully, and I force myself to smile. "I wouldn't mind." I lean against the polished wooden counter, propping myself on my elbows, and let the warmth from the fire seep into my bones. "How's business?" "Not bad." My father briefly turns away to take payment from a customer. "Not bad at all, really, all things considered." He catches my eye. "Things all right with you, are they? You've been gone a long time." "I went to see Mr. Loveday." "Had a few things to say to you, did he?" Father fills a glass with beer, and sets it down in front of me. I take a long drink and set down my glass. Father hasn't moved away, but stands still, his hand on a beer pump, waiting for an answer. I shake my head. Nothing I didn't deserve. He nods and moves away to another customer at the far end of the bar. I take my glass and find a table in the corner. For a midweek evening the pub feels busy. An agreeable hum of voices competes companionably with the snap of the fire in the hearth, and a drowsing contentment comes over me. A few curious glances are directed my way, but, initial curiosity having already been satisfied, no one now approaches. It is a relief. I have had enough confrontation this evening, and while I am happy to be in company, even a polite conversation would demand of me more energy than I feel inclined to summon. Instead, I lean back in my chair and let my surroundings hold me. The place feels strangely unfamiliar, though one of my most vivid memories is of my mother in here, cleaning endlessly. Even now a distinct feeling of guilt assails me whenever my fingers brush the polished surface of the table in front of me. all that, it is a shabby place this evening. The paper is torn in places, and beneath it the walls show signs of damp. Decades of pipe smoke have blackened the ceiling, and the floor is scuffed and splintered with countless boots and stained by years of spilt beer. I like the place better now. It is warmer and more comfortable than I had remembered. Or perhaps it's just me. No one knows comfort better than a man who has been to war. On your own, love. Mrs. King is at my elbow before I'm aware of her approach. I blink up at her for a moment. I've made a stew if you're hungry. Come through to the kitchen. It's got to be better than sitting in here alone. She is momentarily distracted by a burst of laughter from the bar. I see my father in the midst of that hard-working, laughing crowd. He will not forsake them for me. I follow Mrs. King into the kitchen. It is quieter in the kitchen, the air warmed by the stove. A plate of stew is set down before me, and Mrs. King sits in the chair opposite. I notice that she has not served herself. You aren't eating? She shakes her head. I'll eat at home. She smiles at me. Tired. Shattered. I pick up the spoon and lift the food automatically to my mouth. I haven't eaten since Dover, and I am famished. The food is good. I close my eyes to savour the taste. Mrs. King laughs. I'll take that as a compliment. I smile at her and rest my spoon in the dish. How long have you been coming here? It must be 6 months now. Mrs. King pours herself a cup of tea and sips it, watching me. My husband was dead, our daughter married and living up in Horsham. I was lonely on my own, and was just thinking about moving in with Anna when Mr. Forrester came to see me and solved a lot of problems by asking if I could help look after your mother. What about your daughter? She didn't mind. I think she knew I didn't really want to move all that way to be a guest in her house. I like to have my own things about me. I was surprised to hear that Stephen's taken over as assistant curate. Oh, yes. Mrs. King's hard hand brushes some crumbs from the table. Restricted duties, of course. I doubt he could manage more. She sighs. Such a shame. Poor man. Her eyes rest on my dish as I wipe the bowl out with a piece of bread. Still, he's got plenty to do. It was a lot of work for the vicar alone. I should have come home sooner. I push my plate away and reach into my pocket for my cigarettes. People did comment on it. I know they think badly of me. I pause to light my cigarette. Whoever told you that? Mr. Loveday? No, that's not right. He shouldn't have told you that. Mrs. King frowns. I think people were disappointed to lose you so soon after Mr. Forrester, and then when you didn't return. She sighs, and reaching across the table, covers one of my hands with both of hers, looking into my face. Did it never occur to you that people might have been worried about you? Worried? She nods. Some of them wondered if something had happened to you over there. I know your father had his worries on that score. I look up from my cigarette in blank surprise. My father? Are you sure? Of course. Mrs. King looks at me sadly. Why would a father not worry about his son at war? I never heard from him. Even to my own ears my tone is a little defensive. It didn't occur to me. You didn't write either, she replies tartly. It made things harder when people asked after you. People asked after me? I watch her carefully as she nods. She meets my eye. Someone did. I can guess. Stephen. She nods again. Apparently he used to come in every week to ask if there was any news. She gets up and starts to clear the table. This was all before I started here, but it did upset me to hear people talking about him like they did. You know, he's not like he was, she tells me quietly. He was worried about you being in France. More than worried, he was frightened for you. And when your father had to tell him he hadn't heard anything, he was angry. The memory of Stephen that last Christmas still makes me shudder. No, Mrs. King shakes her head. Not angry. He was panic-stricken. He couldn't bear the not knowing. Your father said he thought that he would have taken bad news better than none. She falls silent for a moment. and when she speaks again her voice is sad. Poor, poor man. It breaks my heart when I think how he was when he first came here. So handsome, so refined, and oh, that beautiful voice of his. Despite everything, it is hard not to smile at that, his beautiful voice. I remember the men in the bar laughing at the devotion it seemed to inspire in their wives. Even my mother, who never approved of any foreigner, by which she meant anyone from outside the county, had not been able to deny that it made the sermons easier to bear. In the early days I tried very hard to copy it, ashamed of my own rolling accent, but it was a unique gift, of which Stephen seemed quite unaware. Mrs. King sniffs, looking around the kitchen for any other little task that might deserve her attention. Such a shame. He had everything going for him, and now, to see him in that state, and in public, I couldn't let it go on. What did you do? I told his wife. Mrs. King lowers her voice and looks at me as though she is confessing a crime. It had got to the point where people were going into the pub just so they could watch him go through the ritual. By then he was coming in every day to ask, sometimes twice on the same day. He was making such a show of himself. I had a word with Mrs. Forrester, and he hasn't been in since. I think she refused to let him out of the house for a week, broke him out of the habit or some such. Then suddenly there he was filling in for you as curate. Mainly he just does the local prayer days and some of the late evening services that have been laid on for this national mission Mr. Loveday's so keen on. Just little things like that. I think she must have asked Mr. Loveday to let him help. I'm pleased he agreed, I say, meaning it. How is he, Stephen? Mrs. King glances at me and sits down again. As far as I can see, he's bearing up. I think he would have liked to do some of the pastoral visits as well, but some people were a bit wary of him, you know. She looks at me and taps her temple. But for all that, there haven't been any more incidents, and he seems a bit happier. I think it helps him, having something to do. Idleness doesn't do anyone any good, especially these nervous types. She gets up and covers over the rest of the stew. That's for your father when he finishes work, she tells me, pointing. I'll just go up and see if your mother wants anything. Then I'll be off. I should go and see him, Stephen, I say, more to myself than to Mrs. King. She stops what she's doing and looks at me. You should, she says. I think he'd like that. It might do you a bit of good too. She smiles. Good night, love. Once Mrs. King has gone home, I say goodbye to my father and go upstairs. I hear my mother coughing in her room and knock on the door. Mother, is there anything you need? The coughing stops immediately. I put my hand on the door handle, but have an image of my mother in her bed, watching the door tensely, wishing it were anyone but me, and think better of it. Good night, Mother. As I pass along the corridor, her coughing resumes. My room is as it has always been, the washstand opposite the door, the bed with its sunken mattress along one wall. Beside it a table stands beneath a grubby window that looks down into the yard below. It has been 16 years, and still I cannot look at the bed until the lamp has been lit. Even in the lamplight the memory of Jack laid out in his best clothes lingers in my mind as I undress and climb beneath the covers. Still keeping rigidly to my own side, my gaze fixed on the lamplight until my eyes grow heavy. As sleep approaches, I see Stephen kneeling in front of the altar and regret running away from him. I have no right to resent him for his silence. He could not have done otherwise. His brother was quite right to demand what he did, and I agreed to it at the time. If I am censured now by our congregation as a result of what they think they know, it would be 100 times worse for Stephen if they understood what really happened. As I lay there, my mind sorts through everything I have learned this evening. Does Stephen blame himself still? It upsets me to think so. I had hoped to do some good in this world, to have people smile at me and welcome or come to me in need, not feel ashamed at the mention of my name or panic to think of me in danger. I turn in my bed. My mind is tight with self-reproach, but there is no relief to be had tonight. No relief, and no sleep. Eventually, resigning myself to wakefulness, I sit up and reach for my Bible. Something slips out onto the blanket, something that awakes in me a feeling of deep unease. It is the letter that Stephen wrote to me from hospital all those years ago. I pick it up and read the address again. My stomach goes over at the sight of the erratic handwriting. Even now the words mean nothing, a jumble of images without a context, dark and at the same time ridiculous, strangely childish, a frightened infant whispering his nightmares. It repelled me at the time, that glimpse into his disturbed state of mind, and yet I kept the letter, out of guilt. It is years old now. The fear I felt then has lost its edge. I owe it to him to read it now. Dear Leo, they have told me what I did, or tried to do to you, and I understand at last why you have kept away even though I am now allowed visitors. What I did, it is not enough to say that I am sorry, though I do so again and again. I know that the damage has been done, and this apology comes too late. Too late, too late. Stephen Forrester has always been too late. Not even my dreams allow me to make amends, but torment me instead with what should have been, but what was not. Oh, my friend, for years I have longed for the forgetfulness that comes with old age, just so that my mind could be still. But here I have come full circle, and shall never now know peace. Behind every closed door, always a darkened face and unlaced shoes. I despise and despair of myself, but do not you despise me, my friend, my brother. The tower crumbles while the devil bangs his drum, and I can only pray that you will never come to fear the dark as I do. Stephen Forrester. The paper is thin, flimsy, even transparent in places where the ink is smudged. The words "my brother" are almost washed away, and it doesn't take much to imagine the distress he was in when he wrote them. Yet instead of the abhorrence I expected to feel, it is now the thought of his tears that strike me to the heart. How could I have been so cruel? What would it have cost me, really, to have at least written to him? That boy on the boat this morning, what was his name? Phillips. Yes, Private Phillips. I could do nothing but listen to him, but even that little thing seemed to help him. I owed Stephen much more. I still do. Tomorrow, I promise myself. Tomorrow I shall go and find him, and make things right. Good night.